Bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. That is 1 Kings 18, verse 19. That is not a scholar saying this. That is not a critic, not a skeptic, not somebody with an agenda against the faith. That is your Bible. That is a verse you may have read a dozen times without stopping to count the number. 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Asherah. 850 people working full-time on the payroll of the royal household of Israel, serving gods that were not the God of your Sunday school lesson. Now here's the thing. I want you to sit with that number for a moment before we go any further. 850, paid, official, state-funded. And on the other side of that number, you have one prophet of Yahweh standing on a mountain. Just one. Elijah. The story you were probably taught was that the Israelites wandered away from God from time to time, that Baal worship was a kind of spiritual stumble, a brief temptation, a moment of weakness, something the prophets corrected and the people returned from. A relapse, a deviation. That is the framing most of us grew up with. I am here to tell you that the text does not support that framing. Not even a little. And once I show you what the text actually says, what the archaeology actually shows, and what scholars like Israel Finkelstein, Mark S. Smith, and William Dever have spent decades documenting, I think you are going to look at that number differently. I think you are going to look at a lot of things differently. My name is Howard. I taught high school history for 35 years in Knoxville, Tennessee. I was a Southern Baptist deacon for 22 years. I have read the Bible more times than I can count. I started reading it even more carefully after my wife passed, looking for comfort, and instead I found something I was not prepared for. I found that the story I had been told about the Bible was not the same as the story the Bible actually tells. This is one of those stories. Let me put the timeline in front of you, because I think that is where this starts to break down for most people. The Israelites entered Canaan, what we today call the Promised Land, somewhere around the late 12th century before Christ. The northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians in 722 BCE. That is roughly 450 years, 4.5 centuries. And during that entire stretch of time, Baal worship was not a deviation. In significant portions of that period, it was the official religion of the state. I want to give you a comparison that might help that land. The United States of America declared independence in 1776. As I speak to you now, that country is 250 years old. 400 years ago, there was no United States. There were barely any permanent European settlements on the continent at all. 400 years is longer than this country has existed. Now imagine someone telling you that the United States briefly experimented with a different form of government for 400 years before returning to democracy. At what point does experiment stop being the right word? At what point do you have to say, this was just the way things were? That is the question I am asking about Baal worship in Israel, because the text itself is not hiding this. The writers of 1 Kings are condemning what they are describing, but they are also describing it. They are telling you it happened. They are giving you the names, the numbers, the institutions. And if you read those passages with the eyes of a historian, instead of the eyes of someone trying to preserve a theological conclusion, a very different picture emerges. Stay with me on this. Let us go back to 1 Kings 18. The setting is the reign of Ahab, king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Ahab ruled from approximately 874 to 853 BCE. His wife was Jezebel, daughter of the king of Sidon, from Phoenicia. And when Jezebel came to Israel, she did not leave her gods at the border. She brought them with her. She installed them. She funded their clergy. The text says she cut off, that is the language used, she cut off the prophets of Yahweh. She was eliminating the competition. And in their place, she established 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, all eating at her table. Royal provision, royal protection. Now, I need you to understand what Baal was and why ordinary Israelites followed him, because this is not a story about people being deceived by something they knew was false. These people genuinely believed that Baal was real and that Baal controlled the things that mattered most to their survival. Baal was the storm god of the ancient Near East. Baal sent the rain. Baal controlled the fertility of the land. In an agricultural society where drought meant famine and famine meant death, Baal was not an abstract theological concept. He was the most practical god imaginable. You prayed to Baal because you needed your crops to grow. You sacrificed to Baal because you needed your livestock to be healthy. You kept his prophets because you needed access to whoever controlled the weather. And this is precisely why the confrontation on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18 is structured the way it is. The contest between Elijah and the 450 prophets of Baal is a contest over rain. Yahweh had sent a drought, the text says, 3 years without rain. And then on Mount Carmel, fire comes down from heaven and burns up Elijah's sacrifice. And after that, after the 450 prophets of Baal are killed, the rain finally comes. The entire drama is about who controls the rain. That was the central question for ordinary Israelites trying to decide which God to follow. Not a theological debate. Not an argument about the nature of divinity. A practical question. Who sends the rain? But here is what we need to notice. Ahab was not some foreign invader imposing Baal worship on a resistant population. He was the king of Israel, the son of Omri, who founded a dynasty that ruled for 4 generations. The Omride dynasty, Omri, Ahab, Ahaziah, Joram, ruled the northern kingdom from approximately 884 to 842 BCE, more than 40 years of state-supported Baal worship at the highest levels of Israelite government. And the Omrides were not fringe kings, they were politically powerful. Archaeologically, the Omride period is one of the best documented in Israelite history. Their building projects are visible in the ground. Megiddo, Hazor, Samaria, massive construction, sophisticated administration, international trade connections. Ahab's ivory palace is mentioned in 1 Kings and confirmed archaeologically. These were not weak kings presiding over a small cult. They ran a functioning state, and their state-funded Baal worship. Now, I want to take you somewhere that most Sunday school lessons do not go. I want to take you to a place called Kuntillet Ajrud. Kuntillet Ajrud is a site in the Sinai Desert, near what is now the border between Israel and Egypt. In the 1970s, archaeologists excavating there found a storage facility dating to approximately the 8th century BCE, and on the plaster walls and storage jars of that facility, they found inscriptions. Here is one of them. I am going to read it to you slowly because I want you to hear every word. I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. That inscription is from the 8th century before Christ. It comes from within the territory of ancient Israel, and it refers to Yahweh and his Asherah, not the Asherah of the Canaanites, not a foreign deity, Yahweh's Asherah. Asherah was a goddess. She was the consort of El in the Canaanite tradition, the wife of the chief deity. And here, at a site that is Israelite in character, an inscription is blessing someone in the name of Yahweh and his wife. There were multiple such inscriptions at Kuntillet Ajrud. They were published in Biblical Archaeology Review in 1984 and have been the subject of intense scholarly debate ever since. The Israel Antiquities Authority has confirmed their authenticity. They are not forgeries. They are not misreadings. They are what they appear to be. I'll be honest with you. When I first encountered those inscriptions, I sat with that for a while, because they do not fit the story I had been told about Israelite religion. They suggest that in the 8th century BCE, the same century when the great writing prophets like Amos and Hosea were condemning Baal worship, in that same century, in an Israelite context, people were referring to Yahweh as having a consort. William Dever, A scholar at the University of Arizona spent decades excavating Israelite sites and wrote a book about this called Did God Have a Wife?, published by Eerdmans in 2005. And Dever's conclusion, based on the archaeology, was straightforward. Baal and Asherah figurines were common household objects throughout Israelite settlements, not confined to Canaanite areas, not hidden in shameful corners, present in ordinary Israelite homes across the period of the settlement. He wrote, "Archaeology brings everyday folk to light and allows them to speak for themselves, and most of them were not Orthodox believers. Not Orthodox believers, and that is the key phrase, because the religion that we call Orthodox Israelite monotheism, the worship of Yahweh alone, without any other gods beside him, was not the religion of most Israelites for most of the period described in the Hebrew Bible. It was the religion that a specific group of reformers and editors wanted people to have. The religion they were trying to establish. The religion they were condemning people for failing to maintain. There is a difference between the religion people were supposed to have and the religion people actually had. And the archaeology is one of the few windows we have into the religion people actually had. This brings me to something that took me a long time to understand, and I think it is the most important thing I can say to you in this video. The books of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, the books that contain all these condemnations of Baal worship, all these descriptions of Israel's unfaithfulness, all these stories of kings who did evil in the sight of the Lord. Those books were not written during the events they describe. They were written later. Much later. The scholarly consensus, which goes back to at least the 19th century and has been refined considerably since, is that 1 and 2 Kings were written and edited by what scholars call the Deuteronomistic historians. These were scribes and theologians working in the late 7th and 6th centuries BCE, the period of the Josianic reform under King Josiah, and then the Babylonian exile. That means the books describing Baal worship in the 9th century BCE were written 200 years after those events by people with a very specific theological agenda. The agenda was this: explain why Israel fell to Assyria in 722 BCE and why Judah fell to Babylon in 586 BCE. And the explanation the Deuteronomists gave was because they worshipped other gods. Because they followed Baal. Because they abandoned Yahweh. Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman, in their landmark book The Bible Unearthed, published by the Free Press in 2001, put it this way: the writers of Kings fabricated the myth about the despicable Omrides as retrospective propaganda. The Omrides were politically successful. Archaeologically, they left a significant footprint. But they were not worshippers of Yahweh alone, and so the Deuteronomistic editors painted them as the villains of Israelite history. The story of Baal worship as apostasy, as deviation from an original pure monotheism, was written by people who came after Baal worship had ended, trying to explain a catastrophe that had already happened. They projected their theological standards backward onto a period when those standards did not yet exist. Think about what that means. The very narrative that frames Baal worship as a spiritual failure, that narrative was invented after the fact, by people with a reason to tell it that way. This does not mean they were lying in a simple sense. They believed what they were writing. They believed that Israel had been unfaithful to Yahweh. But the standard of faithfulness they were applying, exclusive worship of Yahweh alone, no other gods, no Asherah, no Baal, that standard was a relatively late development in Israelite religion. It was not the standard most Israelites had lived by. Mark S. Smith, a scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary, documented this in extraordinary detail in his book The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, published by Oxford University Press in 2001. His conclusion was that Yahweh alone monotheism, true exclusive monotheism, only emerged in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, the same period when the Deuteronomists were writing. Before that, what you had in Israel was what scholars call monolatry, the worship of one god as primary, while acknowledging that other gods exist. Baal existed. Asherah existed. El existed. The Israelites did not necessarily deny the existence of these deities. They were supposed to worship Yahweh primarily. But the idea that Yahweh was the only God, that all other gods were simply illusions with no reality whatsoever, that idea came later. Smith wrote, "Israelite polytheism was a feature of Israelite religion down through the end of the Iron Age, and monotheism emerged in the 7th and 6th centuries. Down through the end of the Iron Age. That is approximately 700 to 600 BCE. That is close to the period when the Deuteronomists were writing their history. The monotheism that the editors of Kings were enforcing was a relatively new theological position being read backward into a history where it had not yet existed. And that's when it hit me. There is something in the way the prophets speak that I had always read one way, and now I read completely differently. The prophets, Elijah, Elisha, Hosea, Amos, Jeremiah, they are always arguing, pleading, demanding, warning, condemning. They speak as if the people they are addressing could choose either way, as if the outcome is genuinely uncertain, as if Yahweh worship is actually at risk. I had always read that as a kind of dramatic, rhetorical device. The prophets are preachers. Preachers exaggerate. That is what preachers do. Of course, the Israelites really worshipped Yahweh. The prophets were just reminding them of a truth they temporarily forgot. But that is not how you read a text if you let the text speak for itself. If you read the prophets as a historian, if you read them the way I spent 35 years teaching students to read primary sources, they do not read like preachers reminding people of forgotten truths. They read like people fighting an uphill battle. Hosea, writing in the 8th century BCE, speaks with desperation. In Hosea chapter 2, Yahweh says through the prophet, "She did not know that I gave her grain, wine, and oil, and I lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal, she being Israel." And the complaint is not that Israel briefly forgot. The complaint is that Israel genuinely attributed the produce of the land, the grain, the wine, the oil to Baal. Because that was Baal's job. That was what Baal was for. The people were not confused. They were not temporarily misled. They were worshiping Baal because, in their understanding of the world, Baal controlled the things they needed. And Elijah on Mount Carmel, go back and read that passage with this in mind. He is not confronting a group of people who secretly know they are wrong. He is confronting a population that genuinely does not know which God controls the rain. "How long will you waver between two opinions?" he asks them. "If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." That is not the language of someone reminding people of something they already know. That is the language of someone who is genuinely uncertain of the outcome. Elijah did not know those people were going to choose Yahweh. The fire from heaven was necessary precisely because the argument had not yet been won. Now I want to bring you to what I think is the most unsettling part of this whole story. And it is something that changed the way I read the Psalms, the way I read the nature poetry of the Hebrew Bible, the way I understand what happened when Baal worship finally ended. Mark Smith, in The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, made an observation that has stayed with me ever since I encountered it. He documented that Yahweh, over the course of Israelite religious development, absorbed the attributes of Baal. Not defeated and replaced. Absorbed. Let me explain what that means. Baal in the Ugaritic texts, texts from the ancient city of Ugarit in modern Syria, dating to the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, written in a language very closely related to Hebrew. Baal in those texts has a distinctive set of titles and roles. He is the rider of the clouds. He is the storm god who defeats the sea monster of chaos. He is the one who dies and resurrects with the agricultural seasons. He is the deity who sends rain after drought, who brings fertility after death. Now open the Psalms. Psalm 29. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord thunders over the mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. Scholars have pointed out that this psalm bears such close resemblance to Baal hymns from Ugarit, in structure, in imagery, in the specific attributes being praised, that it was almost certainly either adapted from a Baal hymn or composed in direct imitation of one. Psalm 68, verse 4. Sing to God, sing in praise of his name. Extol him who rides on the clouds. Who rides on the clouds? That was Baal's title. That was one of Baal's most distinctive epithets in the Ugaritic texts. Baal-Hadad, the rider of the clouds. And here, in a psalm attributed to David, the same title is being applied to Yahweh. And then there is Psalm 104, which describes Yahweh making springs of water, causing grass to grow, sending rain from above, controlling the seasons of the agricultural year. All of this is Baal's job description. All of it was transferred to Yahweh. Smith's conclusion was that the victory over Baal was not simply a victory of one religion over another, it was a theological absorption. The prophets and the Deuteronomists won the argument about which deity would be worshipped, but they preserved Baal's functional role by transferring it to Yahweh. Yahweh became the rain sender, the storm lord, the rider of clouds, the controller of agricultural fertility, because those were the functions that mattered to ordinary Israelites. And if you were going to convince those Israelites to worship Yahweh alone, you needed to give them a Yahweh who did everything Baal used to do. Come to find out, the God who replaced Baal did so by becoming Baal's functional equivalent. Go back to Mount Carmel one more time. Read 1 Kings 18 with this in mind. Elijah says, "The God who answers by fire, he is God. They call on Baal all morning, and nothing happens. Elijah mocks them. Shout louder! Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." That is Elijah's voice in the text, mocking the prophets of Baal. And then fire comes from heaven and burns Elijah's sacrifice. And then the rain comes. Fire from heaven? Rain after drought. These are Baal's signature miracles. Storm god, lightning, rain. And Yahweh performs them in the very confrontation where Baal is being defeated to prove that Baal's function belongs to him alone. The contest on Mount Carmel is not Yahweh demonstrating something new. It is Yahweh proving he can do what Baal does, but better. It is a functional argument. And the argument is, Baal's rain-making power, Baal's storm god power, belongs to me now, not to him. 450 prophets of Baal were killed that day, according to the text. The text presents this as a great victory for Yahweh. And in one sense it was. But notice what was not killed. The functions those prophets served. The prayers ordinary Israelites prayed over their crops. The needs that drove people to Baal in the first place. Those did not die. They were redirected. Let me give you the picture as I understand it now, after years of sitting with these questions. Israel entered Canaan as a society that already had a complex religious life. Yahweh was their primary deity. That seems to be historically accurate. But Yahweh was worshipped alongside other deities, including El, whose name you can see embedded in words like Israel, Elijah, Elohim, and Baal, and Asherah. The idea that there was an original pure monotheism that was then corrupted by Canaanite influence, that story was invented by later editors. There is no archaeological or textual evidence for an original period of strict Israelite monotheism. For roughly 4 centuries, from the settlement period through the fall of the northern kingdom, what you have is a religious landscape that includes Yahweh, Baal, Asherah, and other deities, all being worshipped to varying degrees by various segments of Israelite society. The elite prophetic tradition, the tradition that eventually produced the texts of the Hebrew Bible, was pushing hard for Yahweh alone. But they were pushing against a current that ran in the opposite direction. The Omride dynasty, as I mentioned, institutionalized Baal worship at the state level. The Kuntillet Ajrud inscriptions show that even in circles that appear to have been connected to Yahweh worship, the imagery of Yahweh having a consort persisted into the 8th century. The prophet Hosea's desperate pleading suggests that in his own time, the 8th century BCE, ordinary Israelites were genuinely uncertain which deity controlled agricultural prosperity. Then came the reforms: Hezekiah in the late 8th century, Josiah in the late 7th. Josiah's reform was particularly sweeping. He destroyed the high places, eliminated competing cult sites, centralized worship in Jerusalem. And it was in Josiah's court, scholars believe, that the Deuteronomistic history was compiled, giving us the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings in roughly their present form. That history, which became the story of Baal worship as apostasy, was written from the perspective of those who had won. Josiah's reformers looked back at 4 centuries of Israelite religious practice and called it sin. They were not describing what happened neutrally. They were constructing a narrative of fall and redemption, one that made their own reforms look like a restoration of an original pure religion. But restoration requires there to have been an original pure state to restore. And the archaeology suggests no such state existed. I want to be careful here, because I know some of you are going to hear all of this and think I am attacking the Bible. That is not my purpose. I have read that book more carefully than most people. I love many of the things in it. I believe there is something true in the prophetic tradition that pushed for Yahweh alone, even if I now understand that tradition differently than I once did. But what I am describing is historical reality. The Bible itself contains it. The number 850 is in 1 Kings. The queen who funded 850 state pagan clergy is in 1 Kings. The confrontation on Carmel is in 1 Kings. The text does not hide this. It frames it as apostasy, yes, but it tells you what happened. And the archaeology fills in what the text leaves out. The Kuntillet Ajrud inscriptions, the Asherah figurines in ordinary Israelite homes across the settlement period, the Ugaritic parallels to Israelite poetry, the absence of any archaeological evidence for a pre-Canaanite period of pure Yahweh monotheism. What all of this tells me is that the religion described in the Hebrew Bible is not a flat, uniform thing. It is a record of a religious struggle, a centuries-long argument within Israelite society about which deity or deities to worship. The voices that won that argument, the prophets, the Deuteronomists, the priestly writers, those are the voices preserved in Scripture. But they preserved also, in the very act of condemning it, a record of the other side of that argument. And that other side lasted 400 years. Plain as day, there is an honest question sitting at the center of all this, and I want to name it directly. If exclusive monotheism, if the worship of Yahweh alone was the divine will from the beginning, why did it take 400 years to establish? Why did the people closest to the events described in the Bible, people who according to the text had witnessed miracles and divine intervention, consistently fail to maintain a religious practice that was supposedly obvious and commanded? One answer is the theological answer: human weakness, the corruption of the flesh, the influence of surrounding nations. That is the answer the Deuteronomists themselves give. But there is another answer, and it is the answer that archaeology and careful historical reading of the text itself supports. The answer is that exclusive monotheism was not the original religion. It was a development, a culmination, a position that emerged gradually through centuries of religious conflict, prophetic preaching, political reform, and catastrophic historical events, the fall of the north to Assyria, the fall of the south to Babylon, that forced a rethinking of how Yahweh worked and what Yahweh required. The religion that came out the other side of the Babylonian exile, the religion of the Second Temple, the religion that eventually gave birth to both Judaism and Christianity, was the product of that process. It was monotheism that had been argued for, fought for, legislated for, and eventually established. But it was not the religion people were born into at the beginning. Mark S. Smith's phrase has stayed with me. Israelite polytheism was a feature of Israelite religion down through the end of the Iron Age, and monotheism emerged in the 7th and 6th centuries, down through the end of the Iron Age. For the first 4 or 5 centuries of Israelite history, polytheism was a feature, not an exception, not a deviation, a feature. I am not sure how to say this gently, so I am just going to say it the way it came to me. Baal lost. In 722 BCE, the northern kingdom fell to Assyria, and with it the institutional apparatus that had supported Baal worship, the 450 prophets, the Asherah cult, the high places in the hills. The Deuteronomists looked at that fall and said, "This is what happens when you worship Baal," and their interpretation became the story the Bible tells. But Baal did not simply disappear. His job description went somewhere. The rain sender, the storm lord, the rider of clouds, the one who defeats the sea monster of chaos, the one who dies and is reborn with the agricultural cycle. Psalm 29 praises Yahweh in the language of Baal hymns. Psalm 68 gives Yahweh Baal's most famous title. Psalm 104 assigns to Yahweh the agricultural functions that Baal had managed for centuries. When the prophets of Baal were killed on Carmel, the ordinary Israelites watching that scene still needed someone to send the rain. They still needed a storm lord. They still needed a deity who controlled the things that mattered to people who lived or died by the harvest. And Yahweh provided that. The argument of Mount Carmel was not just Yahweh exists and Baal does not. The argument was Yahweh does what you thought Baal did, and he does it better. The fire and the rain at the end of 1 Kings 18 are Yahweh performing Baal's function, demonstrating Baal's power, claiming Baal's domain. Baal lost the argument, but his job description went somewhere. And where it went is into the text you call sacred, into the psalms you sing, into the imagery of a God who rides the storm, breaks the cedars, sends the lightning, and opens the windows of heaven to give rain. I sat with that for a long while. I am not going to tell you what to do with it. That is between you and your conscience and whatever you believe about the nature of Scripture and revelation and how God has worked in history. But I think you should know it. I think that number, 850, should not slip past you unexamined. I think 400 years deserves more than the word stumble. That is the truth of it. Make of that what you will. I want to leave you with one image. There is a storage jar sitting in a museum from the 8th century before Christ, from the Sinai desert. On that jar, someone wrote words that have survived nearly 3,000 years. I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. His Asherah. That jar was made in a period when the prophets Amos and Hosea were preaching, when the kingdom of Israel still stood, when you could walk into Samaria and find the temples, find the priests, find the altars to Baal. Whoever made that jar was not confused. They were not deceived. They were not worshiping in ignorance. They were doing what their parents had done, and their grandparents before them, in the land they called home, in the tradition they had inherited. And 3,000 years later, a retired school teacher from Knoxville, Tennessee, sat down and read the inscription, and then turned back to 1 Kings 18 and read the number again. 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table, 850. I couldn't believe what I was reading. And then I could.